So now I'll introduce the second speaker for the opposition to continue the case for the opposition, Claire Fox.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Important discussion. I want to start by agreeing with my opponent, Matthew, that private organisations should indeed be free not to give platforms to people should they not want to. I organise an annual festival called the Battle of Ideas, and I'm not obliged to give anyone a speaker. No speaker is entitled to speak, and also, if you're a publisher, you shouldn't feel that you have to publish someone. That's perfectly legitimate. What no platform is about, though, is if somebody's been invited to speak, when there is a kerfuffle caused and they are cancelled, and therefore they've been no platformed. But I think there's a broader problem that we face at the moment, which is that there is an increasing pressure on organisations to not provide platforms for a larger number of people. A more censorious atmosphere that means that private organisations, such as newspapers or publishing houses, are under pressure, even from their own staff, but often because of a very loud and vocal opposition to, for example, featuring certain columnists who have been regular columnists, and then there's calls for them to be sacked or else, or publishing novels. No, thank you. Publishing novels by people who, for their politics, people have decided should never have a platform. And I think there's a broader atmosphere that chills free speech in terms of the number of topics that are now verboten. Organisers of events such as this worry that if they invite the wrong speaker that is too contentious, that person might be no platformed for being offensive. And so it narrows down who you'd think of inviting. Just to give an example, I was recently asked to speak at a debate by Sussex University on Generation Snowflake. By the time the debate happened, the organisers of the Student Society looked so hassled they'd aged by many years because they'd had to go through so much trouble for inviting some of the speakers. And they drew the conclusion that maybe they'd choose less contentious issues in the future. So whether it's government's prevent policy, which vets speakers and is a chilling impact on who is platformed, and that's mirrored by safe space student activists vetting for who's speaking in case they are hate speakers, then I do think we've got a problem of a greater problem of no platform. It might seem obvious that you'll know which views are hate speech, by the way, but are you sure? We've heard Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins mentioned and various people, but if you're called a racist, should you just be no platform because somebody calls you a racist? I'd object to that because, for example, people who voted Brexit in the EU referendum have been routinely called racist. And therefore, these terms are now so broadly and widely used that you would actually platform very few people. I think this atmosphere turns issues into a toxic issue, and you won't go there. So the categorization of criticism of trans ideas are now called hate speech means that many people will avoid the issue rather than be accused of hate speech. And essentially now there is a blacklist of feminist activists and lesbian activists who are blacklisted from being given a platform because they defend women's rights or because it's just too contentious. I was invited to speak at an international relations event by Oxford University 3 years after the EU referendum. They'd had 8 debates on the issue of leaving the European Union, and I was the first leaver that had spoken at any of those events. And then there was an objection to me being given a platform, and people were outraged that I was there. The reason I'm saying that is because Brexit had become a toxic issue in Oxford University. And although lots of people sidled up to me afterwards, students said I'm secretly a leaver, there had never been a recognition that that issue should be properly debated. And having somebody who had simply voted on the winning side in a referendum was enough to cause a problem. So I think there's a narrow range of views and topics available, and particularly to students. And it's somebody else always who decides what you can hear. So the key for me is less on an emphasis on no platform as a form of censorship that prevents people from speaking, but no platform as a way of preventing audiences from hearing. Thomas Paine wrote in the preface to The Rights of Man, censorship is always more a sentence on the public than the author, and I agree. It's true that open debate is unlikely to persuade your opponents of your side. They're pretty firm in their views. But in public debates, it's not about winning over the opposing speaker. It's about winning over the audience. Is it about defeating ideas that you oppose, holding them up to the light and exposing them to scrutiny, and then winning over the hearts and minds of the public audience? It seems to me then that their justification for no platform shows contempt for the audience and does that through using the language of harm of speech. One argument is that some people's free speech will incite those listening to harm others, as though just by hearing racist views, the audience will uncritically accept them and fall prey to those ideas. And as
On
though,
that point?
no, thank you. It's already been explained by one of the earlier speakers that this treats audiences as attack dogs, automatons who are not capable of using their agency to make moral judgments about what's right and wrong. But a broader definition of harm used is to suppress hate speech is that offensive ideas might psychologically harm people. This therapeutic and subjective expansion of J.S. Mill's harm principle conceives of the audience as vulnerable and weak and in need of protection. And this seems a dangerous, diminishing and patronising way of viewing and infantilising student audiences, as though they'll be unable to cope with uncomfortable or contentious speech. And to say that you're doing it especially to protect minority groups is, I find, an egregious view and paternalistic view. So if we are banning somebody, no platforming them to protect women, for example, it treats women as though they need to be looked after, as though they're the weakest sex and incapable of arguing back. I also wonder what it says about no platforms attitudes to audiences, that it assumes the audience members can't be won over to your side of the argument without silencing your opponents. Surely that demonstrates a lack of belief in the strength of one's own arguments, and it's ultimately a conservative position. There's no possibility of changing someone else's mind or being open-minded enough to have your own mind change. So it assumes a status quo. No thanks. Here forever, that nothing will change. I know that there was some controversy last year about a debate that you had, your own society, on the decriminalisation of abortion, of inviting Anne Widdecombe to speak. To quote the tab, it said, platforming Anne Widdecombe was an uncomfortable part of the debate due to her track record of untenable and harmful positions that represented only a small minority of socially conservative views. Well, given that so few people share Widdecombe's extreme views on abortion, he went on to say that it would be reckless, as so few supported her, to give her a platform. And I want to ask the no platformers this. Should all minority views be treated as unworthy of a platform, as Anne Widdecombe's was in that editorial? But it's also a reminder that until relatively recently, it was pro-choice ideas that were the minority, and the socially conservative anti-abortion views were those that dominated. How do you think that changed? That changed through debate and convincing the majority of the cause of women's rights. At university, when I was 18, a million years ago, I admit it here, pro-life and anti-abortion. I spoke at a debate and I convinced the majority of the audience to support me, and I won. If it was now, I would have been demonised and no platformed. As it happens, the women's group in the audience decided to approach me after the debate and tried to convince me of their point of view. They recommended books that I should read, and they argued with me. I then spent a very uncomfortable year squirming and toing and froing and struggling with my conscience, trying to decide what to do. And I went as an audience member and listened to lots of debates and thought about it. And eventually, I decided that I wanted to oppose, rather than opposing abortion, and luckily my opponents took me seriously enough and persevered, I became a pro-choice activist and a convert. So I say to you in the audience, are your views now the views that you will have into the decades ahead? Will you always have the same views? Are you open to changing your mind about anything? Isn't that the point of debate? And the wider the platforms there are, the more views you hear, the more likely things will change. Society will change. Because otherwise, we're going to have the conservative position of thinking that exactly what you think now is what we will think forevermore. And on that basis, we'd never have fought racism, never have fought slavery, and never have had a majority of people supporting pro-choice views at your university.